The morning light was barely shining through the windows when John woke up earlier than usual. His thoughts were tense, and he couldn't shake the muffled uneasiness that had settled in his soul during the few weeks his wife, Rebecca, had been in another city on business. The usual little things at home, the order, the noise, the laughter, the clinking of mugs in the kitchen had all disappeared with her departure, and now the house seemed empty, cold, as if it had lost its warmth. He got up, made the bed as she always did, made coffee, and cleaned the living room, trying to restore at least a shadow of the familiar coziness. But his thoughts returned to Rebecca, that elusive anxiety about her trip, her long absence, and her slightly odd, brief phone calls. Her voice seemed distant, as if an invisible barrier had grown between them, but John put it down to her fatigue and the strain of her work. All this went on until the front door creaked softly. John flinched and turned toward the door with a sinking feeling. There she stood in the dark hallway, the light from outside softly outlining her silhouette. Rebecca looked tired, but she was smiling, and in that moment John felt all his anxiety replaced by a warm joy. He hugged her tightly, as if afraid to let her go again. "I've been waiting for you," he murmured, breathing in the scent of her hair, still cold from the street wind. Rebecca smiled, her eyes shimmering with a new light. She hugged him gently in return, as if she too had been searching for this moment of intimacy for a long time. Her shoulders were tense, but there was a soft determination in them. "John, I need to show you something," she said, pulling away and reaching for her bag. A slight flush of excitement ran across her face, and then, with a sinking heart, she held out a small white wand to him. "I have news for you." Her voice trembled, and John looked at the object in her hand, at a complete loss to understand what it could mean. Her words echoed in his head until he heard a simple but stunning confession. "John, I'm pregnant." The words echoed in his ears, and John stared at her in disbelief, trying to digest the unexpected news. Excitement overwhelmed him, but with that feeling came a vague, unsettling doubt. They had long dreamed of a child, but it all seemed a little strange to him. He reached out his hand to hers, hesitating to let go. Are you serious?" he whispered, afraid to believe it, afraid to be disappointed. Rebecca nodded, her eyes glistening with tears as she looked up at him with a slight smile, and John felt his heart clench with conflicting emotions of joy and bewilderment. She laughed softly, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "Yes, John, we're going to be parents," she whispered, hugging him again. "Isn't that worth celebrating?" Her words were full of tenderness, but John felt a sudden uneasiness settle in his soul. They were so close, but he'd felt for a long time that something had changed between them, as if there was some thin, invisible wall he couldn't break down. He hesitated to ask the questions that plagued him at night, afraid to destroy the idol that now reigned between them. Trying to hide his confusion, John kissed her, and in that kiss he sought confirmation of their closeness, their unbreakable bond. But Rebecca seemed to be holding something back, and he felt her smile become a little strained. "You look tired," he said quietly, watching her face. "Maybe you need some rest." Rebecca only nodded, avoiding his gaze, and slowly made her way to the bedroom. John was alone in the living room, trying to deal with the feeling that there was something more lurking in this happiness, something she hadn't told him about yet. He sensed that their conversation wasn't over, that there was something ahead of him that he wasn't ready for. Time dragged on interminably as he waited for Rebecca to wake up. John paced the house, trying to find something to do, but his thoughts kept him busy. Questions and doubts crowded him from the inside, and he realized he couldn't live with the uncertainty. Finally, he returned to the bedroom and sat down next to Rebecca when she opened her eyes. "Rebecca, I want to know the truth," his voice sounded soft but determined. "You're hiding something. I don't want to see you in this tension. Please, tell me everything." She was silent for a long moment, avoiding his gaze, and John felt his heart clench with anticipation. Her face suddenly darkened, and she spoke, as if daring to speak. "John," her voice trembled, I was really in another city for more than just work. I had to see a doctor. It wasn't easy, I was afraid I couldn't do it, that I wouldn't make it." John squeezed her hand, his heart pounding, but he couldn't understand anything. "What are you talking about, Rebecca? Why didn't you say anything?" Her eyes filled with tears, and finally she spoke. "We couldn't do it for a long time, John. I sought help, I was offered treatment, and I didn't want to tell you until I knew for sure. But I guess the treatment worked. We have a chance now, and it's all because of you. You've always believed in me, supported me, and I finally made it." Rebecca's words cut John to the core. He looked at her and saw the woman he'd always loved, but now he felt her pain, the fear she'd hidden for so long. He hugged her tightly, realizing that their story was just beginning and they were ready for a new phase, a new happiness that now seemed like a well-deserved reward. "We couldn't do it for a long time, John. I sought help, I was offered treatment, and I didn't want to tell you until I knew for sure. But I guess the treatment worked. We have a chance now, and it's all because of you. You've always believed in me, supported me, and I finally made it." Rebecca's words cut John to the core. He looked at her and saw the woman he'd always loved, but now he could feel her pain, the fear she'd hidden for so long. He hugged her tightly, realizing that their story was just beginning and they were ready for a new phase, a new happiness that now seemed like a well-deserved reward. John knew that his first meeting with Rebecca was no accident. He'd always had a flair for women like her, dazzlingly beautiful, confident, and surrounded by attention. She seemed to attract his gaze like a magnet, effortlessly. Whenever he saw her, John's heart sank. He knew he didn't belong with Rebecca, an unattractive man with balding hair and graying strands. Her shining blue eyes were like a clear sky over the sea, and her every step seemed filled with confidence. But against all odds, he made up his mind. Her beauty and charm were disconcerting at first, but John was persistent. His attempts to win her attention were delicate, unobtrusive, and that persistence may have been what attracted Rebecca. He caught her glances, noticed her smile, and was always ready to approach her and make conversation. She laughed enigmatically at first, responding to him with ease. But John sensed that there was more to this exchange of glances and gestures than mere friendliness. A year after they met, John could no longer restrain himself. One day, during an evening stroll along the promenade, he suddenly took her hand. It seemed to him that his heart was about to jump out of his chest, but the words were surprisingly simple and right. "Rebecca, be my wife." She did not answer at once, but looked at him with a slight surprise, and at the same time with the same tenderness that had captivated him from the first day. And when her lips finally said yes, her face lit up with a light that John would never forget. Their home, small and cozy, was the epitome of their combined effort and love. Together they repainted the walls, chose the curtains and replanted the flowers in the garden. It was a place they created together, and for John it became the most important place on earth. They spent evenings sitting on the back porch, looking out at the lapping waves and making plans for the future. Whenever Rebecca snuggled up to him, he felt like the happiest man in the world. But the more time passed, the more noticeable her frequent departures became. Whenever Rebecca talked about business trips, John didn't seem to mind, but doubts gnawed at him from the inside. He knew that women like her were always surrounded by attention. More than once he'd had to suppress jealousy and anxiety when he'd seen her among male colleagues. But she always came home with the same sparkle in her eyes and the same easy smile, and he had to remind himself that he trusted her. But in the back of his mind, despite all this joy, John's doubts had not disappeared. Her frequent absences, her mysterious glances, sometimes alien, returned to his thoughts like distant echoes of anxiety. He tried to brush them away, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. He knew he should trust his wife, that this was their shared future baby. But somewhere in the back of his mind a question was drilling into his mind: was she hiding something from him? Over that dinner, John experienced again the very magic that had once drawn him to Rebecca. But at the same time, there was a feeling in his heart that with the news came the beginning of something new and unpredictable in their lives. Memories of how he'd once won Rebecca were weighing on John. Years ago, he'd been younger, and despite his modest charm, he'd been aware of his unassuming appearance. It wasn't easy for him to get her attention. There were always men around Rebecca, bright, confident, ready to get her attention. Her blue eyes, sparkling like the sky over the ocean, and her slender figure made his heart sink. He happened to see her with Richard, one of those who had known Rebecca for a long time and knew her better than John would have liked. Yet he did not give up, strove to be near her, and finally secured her consent. Words seemed simple when he took her hand and proposed. Rebecca answered in the affirmative with such a genuine smile that all doubts dissolved. They bought a house, a cozy, small one, and spent months transforming it into a cozy family nest. Years had passed, but now the shadows of the past and suspicions were returning, filling his mind with anxiety. John tried to brush aside thoughts that Rebecca might have been unfaithful to him. But the strangeness grew, the exhausting business trips, the sets of luxurious lingerie he'd never seen her wear, the scent of new perfume, the red lipstick. It all seemed too far removed from the image of the wife he knew. But he still restrained himself until one day he discovered something that made his heart sink. She returned from the doctor with happy news, but during her story John became wary. Expecting a baby would be a joy, but he was shaken by the due date she mentioned. The calculations didn't add up, they hadn't been close for the past 5 weeks. When he had gently pointed it out to her, Rebecca had only laughed as if it were an amusing misunderstanding, hinting that he just didn't remember, had forgotten. But John felt her words were too practiced, almost rehearsed. She was calm, didn't show the slightest bit of excitement. He pretended to believe her, but inside he felt deceived. One question swirled around in his mind: am I really not seeing things? As time went on, the doubts became too painful. John began to notice unpleasant symptoms and soon took tests. His dreadful premonitions were confirmed, an STD. The shock pierced him to the core. All those petty suspicions that he had driven away, now stood before him in a bright, painful light. A flash of rage came over him, and he felt the distrust turn to unbridled disgust and anger. He could stand it no longer. Determined to act, John went through her things in the morning light when Rebecca left for work. He found lacy lingerie, expensive perfume, red lipstick, and a packet of small protection in the travel purse she'd hidden from him. Looking at it, he could barely contain a contemptuous laugh. "So that's what you are," he whispered bitterly, "you stupid Rebecca. I guess the protection didn't help if I have to get treatment now." Soon his glance stopped on a small note pressed against the wall of the bag. On it was the address of the hotel and a name dash, "With love, Richard." The name Richard pierced him like a knife. He remembered the man Rebecca had once left for him. The idea that Richard might have used that chance for revenge pulsed through his mind. He was the one who had taken Rebecca out of his life once upon a time, and perhaps now Richard was determined to get revenge by taking her back. Everything pointed to her betraying John. Cut off from reality, he tried desperately to find traces of the betrayal in her laptop and mail, but it was all in vain. The only thread was a letter with an address left carelessly, as if she wanted him to find it, as if she couldn't live with the secret herself. Hours of agonizing reflection lay ahead, but one thing he knew for sure: Rebecca had betrayed him, and her frivolous business trips and laughter at his doubts were part of a cruel and cold game. John sat in the silence of his hotel room, stunned by the whirlwind of thoughts and memories. He had long tried to ignore the suspicions, to turn a blind eye to the oddities in Rebecca's behavior. But now those suspicions had come together into one vivid picture, a picture of betrayal, in which he was playing the part of the deceived, naive husband. And the more he thought about it, the angrier he felt. It wasn't even just a betrayal. It was a blow to his pride, to his trust, a shattering of everything they'd built over the years. The thought that Rebecca might have gotten back together with her ex, that she'd been willing to go back to him, leaving John a fool, cut into his soul with unbearable pain. Even more horrifying seemed the prospect that she might have a child with another man. How would he look if he raised another man's child without knowing it? John knew that there could be no more delay, that he had to protect himself, his finances, his life, before it was too late. In his head, like a clock, time was counting down. He knew that if he missed the opportunity now, he risked losing everything later. A couple of days and he was in the office of the best lawyer in town. This man was like a cold calculation. He did not ask unnecessary questions, listened to John with attention, but immediately focused on the solution. Together they discussed every aspect, worked out the details that would help John secure his assets and save face. The first step was a new trust fund. The lawyer suggested setting it up so that John's most valuable possessions, the house, the pension fund, the stocks, would go into it. That way, even if Rebecca tried to sue for something in the divorce, her hands would be tied, she wouldn't be able to claim the property. And then there was the mortgage, which had to be secured against the house and transferred to a separate account, securely protected by a law firm. The next few days became an intense game of disguise for John. He continued to talk to Rebecca as if nothing had changed, maintaining the usual easy conversations, pretending to believe her. He had to remain calm, to hide the tension, not letting her see the slightest sign of concern. But there was a resentment burning in his soul that was turning into cold calculation. He knew he needed proof, so he decided to turn to a private detective. From that point on, the covert surveillance began, and John only waited for the moment when Rebecca would make a mistake that would confirm his hunch. A week passed, and the plan, like a well-oiled machine, began to work. Rebecca suspected nothing, confident that John was still a gullible husband. When she returned from her trip with her friends, as she called it, the house greeted her with a chill. Rebecca looked around. John was gone, as were his belongings. A white envelope lay on the kitchen table. She froze, feeling a strange premonition, and, with trembling hands, opened the papers. Her eyes widened with shock when she saw the divorce papers. The seals, the legal wording, and the cold, detached tone declared the end of their life together. In that instant, the whole world around her seemed to shatter. How could he pull this off? How had he found out? She fumbled around the house, searching for the phone to reach John. But his number was unavailable. Soon she realized she was alone, with an empty house and a reality she'd created herself. Meanwhile, John sat on the edge of the bed in his hotel room, tired but as if liberated. He could feel his heart slowly ceasing to ache. All these years he had built up illusions, believing that their marriage would stand up to any challenge, but Rebecca had shattered that trust. Now he realized it was time to start a new life, free of lies and betrayal.